Okay.
Shalom uvracha. Welcome everybody. It's such an honor to learn together, to get ready for Pesach together. Machon Meir in Jerusalem, I always like to start our learning with a nigun. So with your permission, I'm going to sing a nigun. You're all invited to join in. The words are from the end of the Amidah. We say, Barucheinu Avinu, bless us our Father, Barucheinu Avinu, Kulanu Ke'echad, all of us together. And you know, that's a very appropriate thing, especially on Zoom. Even though we're physically apart, we're very much together. Barucheinu Avinu Kulanu Ke'echad, Ba'or Panecha, with the light, with the inspiration of your countenance. We should be blessed with the peace of God's countenance. Barucheinu Avinu Kulanu Ke'echad, Kulanu Ke'echad, Ba'or Panecha. 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 Ayinayinayinayinayinam, ayinayinam, ananayinam, ayinayinayinayinayinam, ayinayinayinayinam, ayinayinayinayinam, ananayinayinam. Naidam, Maranidam, Aidam, 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 Maranidam, Maranidam, Aidam, Aidam. Excellent. Thank you all so much. Such a pleasure. There's really no way to start our learning other than with starting with a nigun. I'd like to do two things together. I want to start by telling you a short story about Eliyahu Navi. After the story, I'd very much like to learn about the structure of the Hagaddah Shel Pesach, but I want to start with the story. It's one of my favorite stories, and it's very much associated with Leil HaSeder. It's a story that happened about 250 years ago. I heard the story from the father-in-law of a cousin of mine. The name of the person is Harav Zalman Kahana. He lived here in Yerushalayim. He was a very influential person here in Yerushalayim, and he passed away about 20 years ago. And he tells the story 250 years ago in a small town in Poland. There was a very, very sweet Jew. His name was Pinchas. And every year at the Leil HaSeder, Pinchas would dream about Eliyahu Navi. He was brought up as a child, and every year he was told, do you know what happens on Leil HaSeder? Something that doesn't happen at any other day of the year. Something that happens on Seder night that never happens at any other time. Do you know what it is? Eliyahu Navi, Elijah the prophet, enters every single Jewish home on Seder night. At the end of the Seder night, we open our doors. After the meal, we fill up a cup, the cup of Elijah, Kos Shel Eliyahu. We say, Shafoch Chamot Chalago, and pour out your wrath on the nations. And Eliyahu Navi enters our home. And Pinchas says every single year, I open the door. I open the door for Eliyahu Hanavi, and every single year I build up my expectations. I'm so excited that Eliyahu Hanavi is going to come into my Seder, and every year I'm disappointed because every year we open the door and no one comes in. So Pinchas went to see his Rav, the Baal went to see his teacher, and his teacher was a Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Chassidut. So Pinchas went to his teacher, went to the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, and he went to him and he said, every year I get ready for Seder night. Every year I'm so excited. I'm so excited for Eliyahu Hanavi, and every year he doesn't come. So the Baal Shem Tov says to him, what do you want me to do? He says, this year, Pinchas says, if Eliyahu Hanavi doesn't come in, that's it, I'm going to give up. Every year I build up my hopes. Every year it doesn't. What can I do? Tell me what to do at my Leil HaSeder, that this year I will merit Eliyahu Hanavi to join my Seder. So the Baal Shem Tov stroked his holy beard and he says, the truth is, there is one Seder in our neighborhood, and I guarantee to you that Eliyahu Hanavi will enter that Seder this year. But that Seder is not in our town, in Mezibush. It's just outside our town. Just outside the town, there's a forest. And inside the forest, there's a small hut. The small hut belongs to a wood chopper, very poor man. Someone that has very, very little money for Leil HaSeder. But that person, his Seder, Eliyahu Hanavi is going to come in this year. So Pinchas says, I have to be at that Seder. I have to be there. Finally to see Eliyahu Hanavi. I can't imagine the excitement after looking forward all these years, every year, Leil HaSeder, and every year disappointment. This year, Eliyahu Hanavi is going to come. So he starts getting ready, and the Baal Shem Tov says to him, if you want to go to that Seder, if you really want to see Eliyahu Hanavi, if you want to experience it for real, you have to prepare. You have to prepare food, not just for yourself, but you have to prepare enough food for yourself. Motel, the wood chopper, is the one who lives there. Motel and his wife, and they have 8 children, 10 people. So you have to cook enough food for Leil HaSeder, for them, Motel and his wife, 8 children, and yourself, 11 people. Bring enough matzah, enough wine, enough meat, enough vegetables, enough food, enough stuff, in order that you could celebrate the Leil HaSeder with them. But the Baal Shem Tov says that Eliyahu, this Motel, he's a very shy person. If you knock on his door today and say, I want to join you for Leil HaSeder, he'll say no. You have to come to him 2 minutes before, mamash right before Leil HaSeder. Knock on his door, tell him you got stuck in the forest, and tell him you've got nowhere to go, and say, please, can I join you for Leil HaSeder? And I brought everything you need for your Leil HaSeder, all the matzah, all the wine, and all the food. Motel can hardly contain his excitement. This is it. The Baal Shem Tov told him this year, this is how I'm able to see Eliyahu Hanavi. So he packs up his bag, he packs up his wagon, stuffs it up with all the food and all the wine and all the matzah, and he leaves Mezibush. He travels into the forest half an hour before Leil HaSeder, and he knocks on Tucker. Really, there was there a hut. He knocks on the door, and Motel's wife opens the door. And he says to Motel's wife, I have to apologize. I got stuck in the forest, and I can see it's late, and I'm a Jew from another town, and the sun is setting, and Leil HaSeder starts in 10 minutes, and I've got nowhere to go. Please allow me to join you for Leil HaSeder. So Motel's wife says, I'm so sorry. I really wish this was possible. I wish it were possible for you to join, but look at the table here. We haven't got enough food. We haven't got enough wine. We don't have the provisions in order to provide for your Leil HaSeder. I wish we had enough food for us. For so many years, we scraped together from our meager earnings, and we just about scraped together enough for a little bit of wine, a little bit of matzah. But this year is the first year that things were so bad, we don't even have enough money for ourselves. So Pinchas says, look at my wagon. Look at this wagon. I've got wine. I've got matzah. I've got meat. I've got vegetables. I've got pashtia. I've got everything you need. Let's unload the wagon and we can spend Leil HaSeder together. And that's exactly what they did. They unloaded the wagon and they brought all this stuff into this broken hut in the middle of the forest with a rickety table. This table, this flat, had never seen this amount of food in it. Wine, matzah, meat, heaving with food. And they sat down at the Leil HaSeder, Motel and his wife, 8 children, and Pinchas. Pinchas, the Baal Shem Tov told him he's going to see Eliyahu Hanavi. So they sit down at the Leil HaSeder. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? This is the Leil HaSeder that the Baal Shem Tov told Pinchas. This is the Leil HaSeder that he's going to see Eliyahu Hanavi. I mean, he could hardly concentrate. Imagine the excitement as you're going through Manish Tana, and then you go through the 4 sons, the rabbis in Bnei Barak, go through the story, Dayenu, begin Hallel. I mean, could you imagine the excitement knowing that all these years I've been waiting to see Eliyahu Hanavi, and tonight my holy Rebbe told me that I'm going to be blessed to see Eliyahu Hanavi? Can you even imagine? Needless to say, he couldn't eat anything. Pinchas Mamash didn't have any. I mean, he's not going to be eating. He hasn't got the energy to take part in any food at this Leil HaSeder. He was just so overwhelmed with excitement at the prospect of Eliyahu Hanavi coming to the Seder. So they moved on. They moved on through the Leil HaSeder. They had the meal. Pinchas didn't have anything to eat. The children, the wife, Motel, they were so full of gratitude. They'd never seen this amount of food. The Leil HaSeder that they thought they'd have nothing turned out to be the most abundant Seder they'd ever had. And then the meal ended, and they said Birkat HaMazon. They drank the 3rd cup of wine, and it was time to open the door for Eliyahu Hanavi. Can you imagine that moment? Can you even imagine how our heilige friend, imagine how Pinchas friend felt at that moment? So they opened the door in this hut in the middle of the forest. Sweet holy people, do you know what happened? I hate to say terrible things. Nothing happened. No Eliyahu Hanavi. Pinchas just didn't know what to say. He schlepped into the forest. The Baal Shem Tov promised him Eliyahu Hanavi is coming. He left his family. He spent the whole day cooking, bringing this food over to the family in the middle of the forest because the Rebbe told him that Eliyahu Hanavi is going to be there. And then it came to that moment and he wasn't there. First day Chol HaMoed. Pinchas is in shul. And the Baal Shem Tov is there. And you know what? I hate to say terrible things, but Pinchas is angry. He's really angry because the Baal Shem Tov promised him after all these dreams, this is the Seder that you're going to see Eliyahu Hanavi. And he waited, and Eliyahu Hanavi never came. So he goes over to the Baal Shem Tov at the end of the davening, first day Chol HaMoed. He says, sweet holy Rebbe, you sent me to Motel in the forest, this broken shack, with kids that have got nothing. And I sat there with the family, and I left my family, and I sat with them on Leil HaSeder, and no show. Eliyahu Hanavi never came. So the Baal Shem Tov said to sweet holy Pinchas, says, you don't understand. Let me take you on a walk. And the Baal Shem Tov took Pinchas on a walk, and they went for a walk into the forest. And then when they went to the forest, they saw there was a little clearing on the side of the forest. And in this clearing at the side of the forest, they saw the wood choppers. And you know, wood choppers, they get up so early in the morning. They were having their first break for the day. They're having a break. And they saw that one of the wood choppers was telling a story to all the other wood choppers. So Baal Shem Tov says to Mottel, listen to the story. See the story that the wood chopper is telling the other wood choppers. So he gets close and he realizes that the storyteller, the person telling the story, is Mottel, the person he was with on Leil HaSeder. So he puts his ear to hear what's Mottel telling to all the other wood choppers. People, this is so holy. This is what he was saying. Mottel was saying to the wood choppers, you know, this year was the hardest year for our family. Every year we scrape together a little bit of matzah, a little bit of wine, just enough that we can afford to celebrate Leil HaSeder. But this year, for 1,000 different reasons, it was a very hard year. And for us, this year, we can understand it was a hard year for many people. And we really had nothing for Leil HaSeder, Mottel told his friends. And then, do you know what happened? 5 minutes before Leil HaSeder, there was a knock on the door. And do you know who came? It was Eliyahu Hanavi. So the Baal Shem Tov turned to Mottel and he said, you know what? Sometimes it's not your job to bring Eliyahu Hanavi to yourself. Sometimes it's your job for you, Pinchas. Sometimes it's your job to be Eliyahu Hanavi for somebody else. So I want to bless us all as our introduction to our learning that Leil HaSeder is the night of Eliyahu Hanavi. But we should be blessed not only to bring Eliyahu Hanavi to ourselves, but we should be blessed, just like Pinchas, to bring Eliyahu Hanavi to somebody else. Okay, that's my introduction. Now, I want to talk for a few minutes about the structure of the Hagaddah Shel Pesach, and I want to share something with you that I think is incredible. And I think it really comes to the essence of what the Leil HaSeder is the purpose of this special night that's coming up in less than a week. Every night of the year, we have a mitzvah. In fact, about now, here in Yerushalayim, it's getting dark. And we have a mitzvah of remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim every single day. We commemorate the mitzvah of remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim every day by saying the third paragraph of the Shema. And that mitzvah is Zechirat Yetziat Mitzrayim. We remember every night, every day, twice a day, in the morning and in the evening. Every day we remember the exodus from Egypt, Zechirat Yetziat Mitzrayim. On Leil HaSeder, the mitzvah is not to remember the exodus from Egypt. On Leil HaSeder, we have a mitzvah which is on a totally different level. The mitzvah on Leil HaSeder is Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. If every night of the year we have a mitzvah to remember, on Leil HaSeder, we have a requirement to tell the story. So what's the story? What's the story that we tell on Leil HaSeder? How does the story go? So I want to share something interesting with you. If you open the Hagaddah Shel Pesach, I want to go with you very briefly. We're not going to do a Leil HaSeder now, but I'm going to go through the structure of the Leil HaSeder. Stage by stage. We open with Kadesh, we make Kiddush, Urchatz. We wash our hands, Karpas, we eat a vegetable. Yachatz, we take a matzah and we break it in half. Are any of these things telling the story? If I was telling a story, the way that you tell a story is you start with an introduction. You meet the characters, you understand their personalities, you understand who they are, and then something happens, an event, and then people respond to that event. There's sort of 3 stages to a story. You build the characters, and then you have the event, and then the repercussions of the event. That's how we tell a story. But if you look at the Hagaddah Shel Pesach, that's not the story that we tell. Kiddur, Kadesh, Urchatz, Karpas, we eat the Karpas, Yachatz, we break the middle matzah in half. Kadesh, Urchatz, Karpas, Yachatz, Magid. Magid is telling the story. Now, how do we tell the story? We start with Ha Lachma Anya. This is the bread of affliction. Is that the story? Are we introducing the characters? Not really. Then we go to Manish Tana. Is Manish Tana the story? Manish Tana is 4 questions that we tell on Leila Seder. Is that the story? Also, tricky to say that Manish Tana is a story. Are we introduced to the characters? Not yet. We have to assume that you already knew the story when you get to Manish Tana. That's not, even though it's called Magid, the story, is Manish Tana the story? I don't know. After Manish Tana, we then go to a discussion about when to tell the story. Do we tell the story all day? Do we tell it in the morning? Do we tell it in the evening? How's that the story? Then after that, we talk about the rabbis in Bnei Barak. There were 5 rabbis in Bnei Barak, and they were telling the story of the exodus from Egypt, and they were telling the story until their students told them, it's time for Kriyat Shema. How is that the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim? That's not the story. That's telling us about some rabbis, great rabbis, authors of the Mishnah Talmidei Chachamim, our greatest teachers. But is that the story of the exodus from Egypt? It's a story of some rabbis at a Leila Seder. How is that the story of the Exodus? After we learn about the 5 rabbis, we then come to the 4 sons. The wise son, the wicked son, the simple son, the son that doesn't know how to ask any questions. If the mitzvah is to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt, it's important to know about the 4 sons, but how is that the story of the Exodus from Egypt? After we finish that story, we then go back and we read some verses from the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua talks about Abraham, tells really right at the end of the book of Joshua, in chapter 24 of the book of Joshua, we have Joshua telling the Jewish people the story of Jewish history. But it doesn't start at the Exodus from Egypt. It tells us the story of Abraham. It tells us the story of Lavan. But is that the story of the Exodus of Egypt? Lavan bikesh la'akor takol. We are already, for many of us, well into the Seder by now. We've been sitting at the table for an hour, maybe an hour and a half. We've told the Manish Tana. We've spoken about the rabbis in Bnei Barak. We've spoken about the 4 sons. We've spoken about Joshua. We haven't told the story. We haven't said we were slaves. We haven't painted the scene. We haven't described the development. After we talk about the story from Joshua, we speak about God's promise to us. Machon Baruch Shomer Havtachato Yisrael, that in every generation there are people who will rise up, and in every generation we express our gratitude to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's incredible, and we feel it. And for myself, the older you are, and I grew up in London and now I live here in Jerusalem, and you experience Seder over different countries and different lifestyles and different worlds, and you feel it in every generation. But is that the story of the Exodus from Egypt? It's a powerful teaching of Emunah, that in every generation, but how on Seder night, our commandment is to tell the story. We are almost halfway through Magid, halfway through the telling of the story, and we haven't even started the story. Then we come to 4 verses from the book of Deuteronomy. 4 books, 4 verses from the end of the Torah, right at the end of the Torah, when we would bring the first fruits to the temple, we as Jews would make a beautiful declaration. Arami Oved Avi, and we quote the story, where it's really a 4-verse summary of the extras from Egypt, and we get there. That's where it's, it appears there right at the end. But when we tell the story, we don't tell the story from the book of Exodus, from the book of Shemot, where the story unfolded, but we tell the story when we finally get to it. We tell the story not from the event in the book of Shemot, but we tell the story of Moshe Rabbeinu summarizing the story 40 years later, right before he died, in the book of Devarim. And those are the verses that we expound. So when we do finally tell the story, we don't tell the story, but we tell the story that Moshe Rabbeinu told 40 years later, recounting the Exodus from Egypt, but we don't actually tell the story of the event as it transpired, which is interesting. It's interesting because when I look at the Leil HaSeder, when I look at the Hagaddah Shel Pesach, I don't see a story. I see many pieces from different stages in Jewish history. From the book of Devarim, Moshe Rabbeinu at the end of his life. From the book of Joshua at the end of Joshua's life. After the destruction of the second temple, when the rabbis were in Bnei Barak, I see pieces, each one from a different generation. And I had a lovely teacher in London. His name is Rafi Zaran, Dr. Rafi Zaran, Rabbi Dr. Rafi Zaran. And he told something really beautiful. He said that if you look at the Leil HaSeder, and we look at the story that we tell on Leil HaSeder, we don't tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. What we do on Leil HaSeder is we tell the story of the story. What do I mean? I don't sit here today and tell you a story about an event that happened 3,000 years ago. What I do on Leil HaSeder is I tell you, or I connect you, or we connect on the Leil HaSeder. When we sit together on our Leil HaSeder, we connect with a story that has been told and continues to be told for the last 3,500 years. I'm telling the story of how in every generation we tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. The story on Leil HaSeder is not the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. The story is how in every generation we tell the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, and in every generation, we add the next chapter of that story. So when I open my Hagaddah Shel Pesach and I read about the Tanaim, the rabbis of the Mishnah, after the destruction of the Second Temple, having their Leil HaSeder is part of my story. Because my story is the story of, on one night a year, we connect to the chain of Jewish history. We connect together with a chain that's been going on since the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim. The year after Yetziat Mitzrayim, Am Yisrael got together and told the story. And the year after that, they told the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, and they remembered how last year we told the story. And in every generation, we add on the next layer of the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. So I read about Yehoshua, Joshua, because when Joshua tells the story, that's part of my story. When I look at how Moshe Rabbeinu told the story at the end of the Torah, that's also my story. The story is not the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, it's the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. I am linking myself in a chain of Jewish history that goes back all the way back to Yetziat Mitzrayim. I'm not just connecting to an event that happened thousands of years ago, but I'm connecting to every previous year of Leil HaSeder in our Jewish world. Every year since Yetziat Mitzrayim, we've come back and we've told the story. And every year now, when we commemorate, I'm not just commemorating the original story, but the story of, in every year, we've told the story. For many years, we have the honor of telling the story in the Beit HaMikdash, in Yerushalayim. After the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, we told the story in Exodus, in exile. There have been years where the Leil HaSeder was a night of majesty, where the Leil HaSeder was a night of glory, of royalty. And there have also been years where the Leil HaSeder has been private, hidden, because they were worried of persecution. There have been dark years of Leil HaSeder, and all of those years of Leil HaSeder are part of the story. And my Hagaddah Shel Pesach doesn't just tell the original story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, but it connects me to all the generations of Am Yisrael who have been telling the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim from then until now. And this year at my Leil HaSeder, I'm writing the next chapter for my children and my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, Be'ezrat Hashem, the next stage of the story. In our home, we are very, very blessed and very honored that my wife's grandparents will be with us for Leil HaSeder. My wife's parents will be there for Leil HaSeder. But their presence at our Leil HaSeder, they're not just the grandparents of my children, they are also the grandchildren of their grandparents. So their presence in the Leil HaSeder connects us to over 100 years of family Leil HaSeder, because they were there 70, 80 years ago as little children sitting in the Leil HaSeder. But when they sat in the Leil HaSeder 80 years ago as a little child, their grandmother was there and she was 80. So they are a chain with a Leil HaSeder that's been going on for 160 years of the experience. The grandmother brought it, the flavor of the Leil HaSeder that they felt as children, and they bring an echo of that flavor into our Leil HaSeder. We connect to the eternal chain of the Jewish people through the Leil HaSeder, through this magical night, which is Leil HaSeder. And that's why when I look at my Hagaddah, I don't look at the Hagaddah to read a story that happened many, many years ago. I open my Hagaddah to look at the story of the story that has been going on for thousands of years on this magic night, and the story that I will add the next chapter of that story in my Leil HaSeder this year, Be'ezrat Hashem. I start with the four sons because each one brings a different aspect into the story. There are different ways to tell the story. I talk about Joshua because I want to hear about how Joshua's telling of the story is part of my story. I talk about the rabbis in Bnei Barak because their Seder is part of my Sipur Yitziat Mitzrayim, because I'm telling the story of how we tell the story in every generation. Moshe Rabbeinu, we connect to the story that he told at the end of his life, because I want to connect to Moshe Rabbeinu telling the story. It's not connecting to an event, it's connecting to a process that's been going on for thousands of years. Rabbi Sachs, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. Rabbi Sachs, who passed away just a few months ago. He was the chief rabbi of England. And in this context, he mentions that in Hebrew, there is no word for history. Do you know how you say history in modern Hebrew? The subject, history. If you want to learn about history, my kids in school, they have a history teacher. History in Hebrew, the word is historia. Historia, as you can probably tell, is not a Hebrew word. It's not a word from the Tanakh. So what word does the Tanakh use when the Tanakh wants to talk about an event that happened in the past? When it wants to talk about Jewish history, when in the Tanakh wants to talk, when the prophets want to look back at what happened at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, at the time of Avram Avinu, how do they look back? What word do they use? And the word that we use in Tanakh is zikaron. Zikaron. Zachor Yomot Olam, Binu Shmot Shnot Dor Vador. Zachor Yomot Olam. Remember the days of old. We have a mitzvah of, Parashat Zachor a few weeks ago. Remember what Amalek did to us. In Tanakh, in the Jewish tradition, we don't have historia. We have zikaron. What's the difference between historia and zikaron? And Rabbi Sachs explains beautifully. He says that historia, history, is your story. I can learn about English history, the kings and queens of England. I can learn about the French Revolution. I can learn about the American presidents. I can learn about the world, and that's history. Because it's not my story, it's someone else's story. But my story isn't history. My story is a memory. It's zikaron. When we as Jews look back through Jewish history, we don't look at Jewish history as someone else's story. Someone else's story is historia. When I look back in the Jewish past, I look at zikaron, zechirat yetziat Mitzrayim. I remember. Why? because it's not someone else's story. It's my story. And what I do on Leila Seder is, I'm not talking about an event. It's not a history lesson in something that happened to somebody else a long time ago. It's a memory. Now, I know that some of us don't remember because, tachlis, bottom line, none of us were there in Egypt. But you know what happens on Leila Seder? And it doesn't matter if this is your first Seder or your second Seder, or if you've been doing a Seder since you were a child. That doesn't matter. On Seder night, we have an opportunity to become a link in the chain of Jewish memory. What I do on Leila Seder, and this is the power of the night of Leila Seder, I tap in to Jewish memory because I remember, and then I connect to the memories of previous generations of my parents and my grandparents, great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents, or the Jewish story of last generation, the Jewish story of 2 generations, of 5 generations, of 10 generations ago. I connect on Seder night to the Jewish story. But the Jewish story is not a story of history, it's a story of memory. And the story of memory remembers every stage of the story. Do you remember last year when this happened? Do you remember 5 years ago when that happened? 10 years ago when something else happened? One night a year, I connect to the Jewish memory. And that's what I do. That is the story of Seder night. I want to tell you that my Hagaddah, the Hagaddah that I use, I've been using since I was 15 years old. That's over 30 years. I've been using the same Hagaddah. When I was 15 years old, I sat down at my Leil HaSeder next to my grandmother. My grandmother was born in Poland, and then before the Second World War, she moved from Poland. She came to London. And that's where my mother was born. I sat down next to her at my Leil HaSeder, and at one point during the Leil HaSeder, as always happens, like there was a nudge here or a nudge there, she spilled a little wine stain on my Hagaddah Shel Pesach. From that first year that I used the Hagaddah that I use today. And when I open the page on my Hagaddah, where you eat the matzah, there are crumbs of matzah from all the previous years of matzah on my Hagaddah. That wine stain and those crumbs are part of my story. When I look at that wine stain, I think of her. I think of the generations I'm connecting to the Jewish memory on Leil HaSeder. It's the night where we connect with the memory of generations, the Jewish story, from our generation, previous generations, all the way back to the beginning, which was the Exodus from Egypt. It is our night of connection to the Jewish story. And if you look at the Hagaddah takes snippets from different times in Jewish history and allows us to connect to that moment, to a different moment, to the time of Joshua, to the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, to the time of the rabbis of the Mishnah. And I will humbly suggest the stain from my grandmother, the crumbs in the Hagaddah, they're also part of family story. Each year we add a layer to the story. My sister-in-law is studied in Cambridge University in England, and she worked in the Geniza. The Geniza in Cambridge was a remarkable discovery. There's a shul called the Ibn Ezra Shul in Cairo. And about 100 years ago, maybe more than 100 years ago, there was this British archaeologist who happened to be there, and he found this treasure trove of documents, Jewish documents, that were stored in this Geniza in the attic of a shul somewhere in Egypt, and he brought this treasure trove of documents, brought them to Cambridge. That's where he was a professor, and he started sifting through it. And one summer, my sister-in-law worked in the Geniza, and when she worked in this Geniza, she came across many copies of the Hagaddah shel Pesach. And when she looked at these many copies of the Hagaddah shel Pesach, she noticed that it was very rare to find two that had exactly the same text. Many Hagaddah shel Pesach would add particular family memories, family quotes, family tunes, those personalized aspects of the Hagaddah shel Pesach. Why? Because each family was bringing their personal story into the Hagaddah shel Pesach. Each family was bringing their story into it. They were telling the story of the story. Not just the story of the Exodus, but the story of the story. So, sweet, wonderful people, allow me to conclude with a blessing for all of us, that we should be blessed to utilize this powerful book, this powerful night, the night of the Leila Seder. Use it as an opportunity to connect to Jewish memory. Allow it to be a night that we can connect through thousands of years of Jewish history, right from the beginning, from the Exodus from Egypt, the beginning of the story, and generation to generation until this generation, telling the story, connecting to the Jewish memory, and perhaps even more important, writing this year for our future generations, writing the next chapter in the story of the Jewish memory. Thank you all very, very much. It's been a pleasure to learn with you, and wish you all Chag Kasher V'Sameach. Thank you very much.